Welcome to the Choral Connection, a series of interviews with musicians with whom Maestro Harold Rosenbaum has collaborated over his 47-year international conducting career. We hope you are inspired by their artistry and the stories they have to tell. For more about the series, please visit www.haroldrosenbaum.com.
Welcome, everybody. Today, I have as my guest my good friend David Enlow. He's a wonderful organist, and the New Yorker says he's a commanding organist, and he's a teacher and a conductor based in New York who is active in North America and Europe, credited with immense virtuosity by the Stuttgarter Zeitung and performances full of color, passion, invention, and power, says the American Record Guide. David works in concert music and church music. His solo recordings include the complete major organ works of César Franck, Piano à l'orgue, an album of piano transcriptions, and Bach on Park Avenue. David has taught church music, service playing, improvisation, and organ repertoire masterclasses for local, regional, and national events of the American Guild of Organists, the Royal Canadian College of Organists, and at the Juilliard School, from which he received 2 degrees. David has served 2 terms as Dean of the New York City chapter of the AGO, the American Guild of Organists. In national organ performance competitions, he received the first prizes of the Albert Schweitzer Organ Festival and the Arthur Poyster competition. David studied the organ with Paul Jacobs, John Weaver, and John Tuttle, and improvisation with Jer Hancock. He works at the Church of the Resurrection on Manhattan's Upper East Side and Park Avenue Synagogue, and he has appeared in most of New York's major concert halls as an accompanist at the piano with choruses, solo singers, and in performances of chamber music. In early music, David is also organist of the Clarion Music Society. And you can, of course, read more about him online. And I've had the pleasure of working with David a whole bunch of times over the last few years. And welcome. It's always a pleasure when an artist I work with is on the same wavelength as I am. We get the job done, you and I, with fierce concentration and a sense of calm, not letting hurdles thwart our vision and our mission. What comes to mind right away is my first question. When you have the urge to practice, do you have to leave your home and go to the church or somewhere else, or do you have an instrument you can practice on in your home?
Well, that's a good question, and thank you for having me, Maestro. It's an honor to be included in your series. The thing about practicing the organ is that it takes rather more sort of logistical concern than say the flute or the piccolo. We can't carry it around and use any old room. The organ is architectural as an instrument, and so that's always one of the challenges. I'm fortunate in that I have an apartment here at the church, and so I can go down in my slippers to the church and practice theoretically at 2 in the morning. Although the neighborhood might not appreciate that because the organ, again, unlike the flute, can overwhelm buildings and create a nuisance of itself. So that's how it is to practice the organ. I'm very fortunate, having been here since undergraduate days, that I've always had practice facilities right nearby.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't I make a recording in your church?
That's right. Yes, we recorded a living composer's work with him present. Yeah, that's right.
Right. And one of the reasons we chose the church, besides the fact that you were playing and you hosted us, really, if I remember correctly, it's because you can't really hear street noise that much at all. And if that's the case, doesn't it reverse itself so that if you practice at 2 in the morning, people can't hear you outside the church? You're laughing, you're smiling. I don't think that's probably accurate.
Well, no, that's the thing about the quiet neighborhood is that the organ is audible through the walls, and it's true that we're lucky being on a side street rather than on an avenue, that it's better for recording, that we have more silence. Although recordings here have been interrupted by taxi horns and sirens and shouting matches in the street, and the New York soundtrack that we all coexist with?
I mean, I recorded in uh, theoretically soundproof places where you still hear the ambulances go by, and yeah, so it's New York, New York, what a wonderful town. But
That's right.
we get the job done. My
I think
very
the ambulances are in league with the sound engineers to create extra hours for them, but I don't
yeah,
know what that is.
right. My very first CD back in the early '90s, I scheduled 12 hours, and for the first hour and a half, we were dealing with 6 or 8 men upstairs who were knocking down walls because they were reconstructing, they were renovating the apartment, and we couldn't do anything. Um, but we somehow managed to proceed eventually. Um, what are some of the great organs in this country and in Europe? Or is that too broad a question because there are so many?
Well, it's a broad question, but it is a good question because there are, as I've said, the instruments are very much tied to the buildings, and so there's a sense of place with every organ that even the piano and pianos are very different one to another, but uh, people ask sometimes, how do you prepare on different organs that you've never played before? And I say sometimes it's as though you're a clarinetist and they hand you an oboe.
Oh, that's
It's really quite different in some circumstances. But in America, we're very fortunate. We have some really world-class organs. One of the ones I recorded on St. Mary the Virgin in Times Square is certainly got to be in that class. St. John the Divine's organ, which was recently restored after their not the most recent fire, but the fire before that, they seem to collect fires up there. That's a truly world class organ, and I always try to bring this point home in this way that you have to argue pretty hard in automotive circles to say that a Cadillac is as good as a Rolls. But in organ building, the greatest American organs stand shoulder to shoulder with any organs around the world. And so that's a sort of an achievement for this country. I think is important. Uh, so those are a couple of my favorites locally. There are some really incredible examples of organ building across the nation. Sometimes in places you wouldn't expect. Sometimes the great organs are in Columbus, Ohio has one, for example. That's just a world-class machine. And towns in the golden age of American organ building, towns and churches in sort of not metropolis type places put in really just impressive organs. Um, I'm lucky to have been over into Germany and to England and France and played some of the instruments over there. And there, they have national schools of organ building, and so there are sort of regional differences, and they're even now more crossing lines than they did before. I think there you'll find a German organ with French style reeds on it, and vice versa. So it's a very interesting time over there. To pick a favorite organ in Europe is like trying to pick a favorite cathedral as a tourist. They're just an embarrassment of riches over there. But I remember sitting down at Durham Cathedral in England and not wanting to get up, and that's definitely a mountaintop organ over there. And it's in the north of England. It's not in London, but I just remember that instrument's being just beautiful.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of hearing organs throughout Europe, and I've conducted a lot of concerts using organ. Um, Sans Sulpice, that's way up there with biggies, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, it's just a monument of culture. It's a very famous organ that's had some of the most famous composers for the organ and also choral music. Dupre and Vidor and so on. It's just stretching back in a great tradition to the present. Daniel Roth is the titulaire and a great composer of choral and organ music in his own right. So it's really
I remember going to the church service there on a Sunday morning, and my wife and I were sitting there afterwards, and there were like, dozens and dozens of people riveted to a very long postlude for maybe 10 minutes. And we were wondering, like, like so often you see people get up and leave after the benediction, and even throughout the organ postlude, people are walking around, they're shouting hello. but they were so riveted. And then I realized, I looked at their closely at they had name tags, and it was some kind of organist convention.
Uh-huh.
And so then they went upstairs to the in the organ loft, and now is her name pronounced Sophie Chaplin?
Yep.
She gave a little demonstration.
Oh, lovely.
Fantastic experience. Isn't there an organ in a Macy's in Philadelphia or something like that? The
Yes.
biggest organ in America?
It's the largest fully working, well, and of course at that size, it's hard to say, 10 pipes out of the 14,000 whatever pipes might not be working at any given time. Sort of like an aircraft carrier is working even if, some systems are down. Yeah, that's the John Wanamaker store in Philadelphia, which went through a bunch of owners and is now Macy's. That's a really interesting instrument. I used to be one of the assistants there. I would play some of the 2 concerts a day they have every day, 12, whatever it used to be, 12 and 5:15 or something like that. And so they play for the shoppers. We were encouraged to keep it down a little bit as it's hard to sell shoes when the pipe organ is going. And it people get hung up on the size, and it's true. It's I think the second largest complete pipe organ in the States. The largest is in Atlantic City, and they're actually working on getting it running, which is a really exciting prospect on Boardwalk Hall. But the Wanamaker organ is also, I think this is the most important thing. It's one of the most beautiful organs in the United States. It's also a landmark just of its sound. Its impressive size, but it's also just a gorgeous organ. It's very unusual in that it's a truly orchestral conception. In organ terms, we have diapasons, which are kind of normal organ sounds, and then they have string stops, which are normally sort of thin on the thin side. And in the Wanamaker organ, it has a string organ as the main core of the ensemble, 88 ranks of strings, probably more by now. And so it's a very unusual instrument, and you hear it within 10 seconds, you're listening to the Wanamaker organ because it actually has string sound at its heart.
Wow, it's amazing. And you say it was built, when we in inside Macy's when it was a store, or was it built inside a building that became Macy's?
No, it was a store, and it's funny. As New Yorkers, we used to have a John Wanamaker store. One of the outbuildings of the store is still extant, and it looks like the Philadelphia store. And it had a concert hall attached with 100-something rank pipe organ, not the 400 ranks that they have down in Philadelphia, but they did. It was considered by the Wanamakers, particularly Rodman Wanamaker, who enlarged the organ, the son of the founder, to be a great thing that they could offer the populace, in a civic-minded way, that they could share that beautiful music. And they had concerts with orchestra in the store, and it did everything they set out to do. It made it a cultural and sonic attraction for thousands and thousands of people to come and maybe buy some handkerchiefs on the way out the door as they heard the organ.
Now you have canned music, and I once walked into a supermarket in Manhattan, and rapping was going on. Not WRAPP, but rapping, and I just walked out. I just I can barely tolerate Muzak, but when I'm put on hold when I make phone calls and I hear Mozart, it's great. I mean, time goes by more quickly.
It does pass the time more quickly. Yes, in the Wanamaker store, the blower switch used to be next to the Muzak switch, which that was the development they put in so the organist could turn off the Muzak and turn on the organ in the same gesture. So.
Yeah, and that's sort of a deeper meaning, a double meaning in that also. So most organists I know are less comfortable playing piano because the technique is different. I wonder how often we come across professional organists who also studied piano. I think you have, but correct me if I'm wrong. And is it easy to adjust from one technique to another?
Well, it's sort of a familial relationship between the two instruments. Sometimes they're cousins who get along very well, and sometimes they fight. I did study the piano, not to the same. I didn't do it in any college level or anything like that. However, I surprisingly end up using piano skills a lot more than I expected. And part of that's the changing nature of religious music. At Park Avenue Synagogue, for example, the piano drives a lot of the service music. And the organ is still present there, but it's more a piano service than it ever was. Um, Regarding the technique to change back and forth, it's certainly, for me, I have a transition period of about a half an hour. If I've been playing the organ a lot and I get to the piano, I play it like a drum for about half an hour until the sort of more subtle finger and arm weight returns, and then when I go back to the organ, I find that I'm moving sort of expressively like a pianist, and it doesn't do anything to the organ, of course, which is more digital in the ways the keys are either up or down.
Um, you ever forget that you're at a piano and you start playing melodies with your feet?
It hasn't happened yet, but as I approach my 40th birthday, I'm sure I'll forget which instrument I'm playing one of these days and start playing harpsichord music or
Yeah,
whatever.
right.
Yeah.
I've been an organist in churches for 51 years, but all these country churches or little churches who basically hired me to run their choirs, and I don't use pedals. But I mean, basically, I don't use pedals. It's you can excommunicate me if you want, but I've been able to to get by and make a living. A piece of my living together. It's been a very good thing to have to make money. Do you think a lot of organists are have to, like, basically not the top concert organists in the world like you, but let's say there are 10,000 organists in this country. Do you think most of them have to piece together a living by doing all the things that you do also, that you might not even have to do, but you do, accompany concerts on piano and things like that?
Absolutely. I think, people are talking about the gig economy these days as, people who have a job and then they also have two or three other things that they do. And I'm sure there were a lot of keyboard musicians, a lot of organists, church musicians thinking, I've been doing this for decades, We all have, a lot of us, something that we do that's considered full time or considered half time, and then we also, being gluttons for punishment or lovers of beauty, we pile on ensembles and endeavors and recordings and collaborations until I'm seeing you smiling, and I know that you collect them like some people collect China dolls or whatever. So you've got just a tremendous collection of efforts. But I think it is increasingly, churches that had a full-time music director, when that person retires nowadays, they're advertising a halftime position, and the churches that had a halftime music director, that person retires and they advertise quarter time or pay per service. And one thing we're seeing in the profession is that there is a contraction of the salaries and of the investments that a lot of institutions are making. I'm fortunate that my institutions are healthy enough and investing in their musical programs as part of what they believe will attract people to them. And I think there's a great deal of wisdom in that. I hope so. But it's true that a lot of us are facing institutions that are troubled, and in turn having to do, whether they want to or not, many different things. People will do teaching and accompanying and all, just piecing together, as you said, a whole host of musical activities.
Well, it's good that we're in New York City because there are endless opportunities. I mean, there are also endless numbers of people who want to take advantage of those opportunities. But if you have a certain skill, you'll do well. Um, the worst organ I ever played on was up here where I live. I live in Upper Westchester County, and I was hired to play for a wedding in this little chapel. I mean, the half of the notes weren't even working, but I wanted to do it because it's the chapel where Marilyn Monroe married Arthur Miller. So right across the street from where Elliott Carter spent his summers composing, and right a couple hundred yards from where Aaron Copland spent his summers for a long time.
Incredible.
Walkabout, yeah, but the organ the organ was just awful. It was more like a hurdy-gurdy. I remember in England leaving, what is it? There was the Westminster Abbey, leaving as the organ was playing and walking outside and hearing a hurdy-gurdy with a guy with a monkey and the juxtaposition was so stark.
That's it. From sacred to profane, you were sort of.
Right, like Britain's Sacred and Profane piece. um, I wanted to just ask about improvisation, because um, you know, when we think of improvisation, we don't think of pianists, but we think of organists. And that's a big part of every organist's training. And if so, why?
Well, it's a big part of our work, but like a lot of our work as organists, it's not always part of the training. And I hope that our current generation of teachers, and I include myself, will work harder to be sure that the training reflects the work that's required. We I took improvisation with Jerry Hancock. It was not required, but I elected to do it because I thought it was important. And it he was one of the great masters of the art in the United States and in fact in the world. And so I was really fortunate to be in his last improvisation class before he stopped teaching here. He then went on to Austin, Texas, and taught many more people. But um, the thing I always think that's really important for improvisation is it elevates the organ uh, to the most lively of arts. You know, who does improvisation now? It's really jazz players and us, and that's it. A colleague of mine pointed out once, you know, concert pianists can play Rachmaninoff 3, but can't make up harmonies to Happy Birthday sometimes. You know, there's a thing about making the music uh, internally and spontaneously that's just can be riveting when it's right. Um, the uh, the thing about improvising at the organ is that the scale of the instrument means that you have sound palettes that are orchestral or symphonic in their scope. You can make the quietest sounds the organ makes, and you can make the mighty racket that shakes the building. And so you now have the ability to improvise in a scale that's monumental and not as you improvise the piano in a scale that's more domestic. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, no, totally. And there's, as far as the need to improvise, I mean, in church services, there's communion and there's offertory, and there are more people in the congregation than you expected, and you had something prepared, and then you have to improvise after that. One time recently, it was 10 o'clock, and I was supposed to begin the. I was no, I was, playing the prelude, and yeah, I remember now. At 5 to 10, my task was to play a 5-minute prelude, and the pastor was there ready to start the service. But then at like 10 seconds before 10 o'clock, he went like, oh, and he walked off the altar because he forgot something. So you have to improvise, unless you start over again. and but if you start over again and he comes right back on, you have to create an ending. So it's a lot of fun. But some of the world's great improvisers, and I'm sure you are one of them, I mean, I can't understand how you can do it. It's just amazing.
Well, it's because it's spontaneous. Sometimes people think, and you've probably heard this opinion that you either can do it or you can't. You sit down and you improvise. But in fact, one of Jerry's favorite sayings was to practice your improvisations. If you play, for example, I will often improvise a fugue, and you can't just sit down and do that. You have to try it and be miserable at it for maybe months or years, and then eventually something useful might start coming out. But and that's the church service is one of those places where it's a necessity. It's just as you're describing. We never know what's going to happen. A church service is like a war. You can start it, but you don't know how it ends. And so we often have to finish or extend as a necessity, and then so there are great musical challenges there.
Right. Well, is there anything else you want to add before we say goodbye? It's been a pleasure, and I've learned a lot.
Well, it's been a real treat. I just want to say I hope that we are able to collaborate again in the fullness of vaccinated time, and it's been a joy to talk with you, and I think back on our collaborations last December in the Christmas concerts that you put on very fondly, and look forward to maybe a future.
Well, remember, I did offer you to play one of my Bach concerts. I think I sent you, I'm not sure if I sent you the music yet, but down the road, we will be doing something for sure, and hopefully more than that. So,
Splendid.
stay tuned, David. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Maestro. We'll see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.